Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first live stream discussion of our class for the semester, our class on race. Race Matters, a multidisciplinary exploration of race in America. And when we say multidisciplinary, we mean it, right, Dr. Carroll? There are, how many, I keep forgetting, 12?
Absolutely. We have many people who will be gathering with us to discuss race through the lens of their just respective disciplines. So we will talk about race from a lot of different perspectives.
Great, yes. And I jumped the gun a little bit. We should probably introduce ourselves, right? Dr. Carroll, my name is Taylor Newton, and I'm an associate professor of psychology here at Lenoir-Rhyne University.
And I am Summer Carroll, and I'm an associate professor of education here at Lenoir-Rhyne.
We are going to introduce our guests very shortly. But before we do that, we wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of how we're going to be spending the hour, because you will have the opportunity to interact with our fantastic guests. At the very bottom of your screen, there is a button that says Q&A. Please make use of that button. If you have any comments or questions for our guests today, we highly encourage you to interact. It's one of the best parts of being able to do this kind of class synchronously, right? So we're live, we'll be able to actually interact with one another. And to respect your time, we're going to be ending this class right at 7 o'clock. It is possible we may not get to all questions, unfortunately. However, we will make this session live, or not live, we'll make this session available tomorrow on Canvas and on YouTube. And you are welcome to use the YouTube comments to keep the conversation going, even if we don't get to all questions today. Mr. McCombs and Dr. McComb, if we could introduce you now. Join in.
Sure, yes. And I have the privilege of introducing my former colleague, Dr. Veronica McComb. Dr. McComb received her PhD in American and New England Studies from Boston University and her BA as a senior fellow in film and television studies from Dartmouth College. Her doctoral work focused on the influence of religion on the immigration experiences of Nigerians in the United States and was generously supported in 2009 and 2010 by the Charlotte Newcomb Dissertation Fellowship for Religion and Ethics from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. In the Lenoir-Rhyne faculty in 2011 and served as a professor and program coordinator of history before becoming the dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. In 2008, Dr. McComb was awarded the Raymond Boss Distinguished Professor Award at Lenoir-Rhyne in recognition for her teaching and mentoring. In 2001, she joined the faculty at Bryant University as the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. Her broader research and teaching interests include race, ethnicity, and immigration, media studies, African diaspora studies, and digital storytelling. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. McComb.
And I get the pleasure of introducing our other special guest for the evening, Mr. Jerry McCombs. No relation, close name, but no relation, right? Mr. McCombs is the president of our Catawba County NAACP. And he just let me know, congratulations, that he's newly a member at large for the executive committee of the state of North Carolina NAACP. He is also a leader and founder of the Catawba County Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which has been doing some fantastic work here in our local community. And he's also a member of the Mount Olin AME Zion Church here in town. So we're so excited to have both of you here today. And I'm going to throw into Dr. McComb she was a faculty member and dean here at LR. We miss her terribly. So it's really a thrill to be able to have her back again here for conversation.
Oh, thank you so much, Taylor. And Mr. McCombs and I actually served for a period of time together on the Historical Association of Catawba County Board of Directors. So it's good to see your face again, Jerry.
It's good to see you.
Have a conversation with you this evening.
It's good to see you also.
We have so many questions, Dr. Carol and I. We had some fun preparing these in advance. So we can just jump right in ourselves.
Sure. I mean, did you want me to start off with a few comments? Okay. I think that the best way for me to sort of kick off why I am interested in this particular area and how I came into this field has a lot to do with where I grew up. So I actually now live pretty close to where I grew up after leaving Hickory. I grew up in Brockton, Massachusetts, which is known as an immigrant city. And a lot like many cities, there's sort of these ethnic enclaves, you know, these places in which specific immigrant communities gather. And the fact that both of my parents are from highly mixed cultural backgrounds means that I have come out with this indeterminate skin tone and complexion and features that folks will continually ask me, you know, where are you from? And I'll say, you know, I'm from Brockton. And what they really mean is, you know, where are your people from? Right. And that's a question that I got since I was very, very young. And I had a lot of interactions with teachers, with classmates that would try to sort of classify me according to not only what I looked like, but what they expected me to, where they expected me to fit based on preconceived notions about Blackness, about whiteness, et cetera. Just for context, my father is from Panama, but it's by way of Jamaica, Barbados, and Costa Rica in terms of his family heritage. And then my mother, born and raised in Massachusetts, but has heritage from the Cape Verde Islands, but also Jewish heritage, Irish heritage, and indigenous heritage as well. So when you place someone like me from a very culturally mixed background in a place like Brockton that has these very distinct ethnic enclaves and racial groupings, I had all these questions about where I belonged. And I remember in first grade that my teacher did this sort of class inventory based on race and also based on Hispanic nationality or affiliation. And they asked first graders, you know, how many of you come from Hispanic households? And I thought, you know, I'm 6. I'm like, well, Hispanic means a Spanish speaking country. My dad's from Panama. So I guess, yes, me. And my first grade teacher told me to put my hand down. I said, no, Veronica, you're Black. And that was the very first interaction I had of, you know, what I felt myself to be and what somebody was telling me I was, right? So all these questions about identity, how I formed my own identity, where I fit, finding community with others, informed my questions and interest in how race is sort of racial identities are formed and communities according to race and ethnicity are formed. You heard my CV or my bio, and so you know I went into a PhD program specifically focusing on issues of race, ethnicity, and immigration in the United States, because I knew that my story was embedded in this very complicated national history of the United States, but this global context as well in terms of these migrations of folks from different national origins and such. So when I talk in the materials that you all looked at, hopefully prior to this evening, or hopefully will look at if you haven't, about things, race being socially constructed, I'm not just speaking from a place of theory or philosophy or my academic training. I'm actually very much speaking from a lived experience, as many of us can, regardless of what racial background we are. The way that we see ourselves, be it our gender, be it our class status, or be it our race, is informed by the environments we find ourselves in, the history that those environments carry, and the kind of changing dynamics of politics and power as those things evolve and grow. So that's my opening spiel.
That was great. Thank you. And I can I can definitely connect to and identify with a lot of what you're saying in terms of how I perceive myself and how others perceive me, and the whole idea of just race as a social construction. When you think about just conventional wisdom, and please excuse my voice, it decided today to go somewhere else. So you guys will have to bear with me. But conventional wisdom points to race in dominant discussions on, right? Typically, if we're talking about discrimination, the first thought is, oh, it must be about race. But in your lecture, you emphasize that identities impact the role race plays in our lives, and that we must consider an intersectional lens when thinking about race. So I just would love for you to talk a little more about if you think there is one form of oppression that is the strongest. Is racial discrimination the most dominant or most significant form of oppression? Why does it seem to be the default?
I think honestly, and so when I teach my classes, particularly, I do a lot of 20th century American history courses. And of course, in the 20th century, we have the rise of a lot of American labor unions as industrialization continues to expand and urbanization continues to develop large cities like New York City, et cetera. And I always say that the biggest sort of trick that the wealthy classes pulled over the American people is to convince them that race was a defining quality of their Americanness. I say that because if you look at a lot of these struggles based on class that have occurred in American history, that if folks in the United States had allied themselves, white folks, Black folks, Latinx folks, Asian folks, around the issue of poverty specifically, or the struggling middle class, there would have been like a lot more sort of gains and movement according to class equality and class equity over the course of the United States. Of course, as we know, we are very much run by a capitalist system. Capitalist system can't function on sort of economic equity, right, in a real powerful way. So what better way to convince people to nuance the differences in their impoverishment by saying, you may be poor, but at least you're not poor and Black, right? And so your whiteness gives you that much of a degree of extra status over someone who is not white. So I would say, contrary to what others might believe, race may be perceived as the dominant factor in the inequality that exists in the United States, but that's to cover up the largely class-based inequality that has occurred historically. And like, I'll just put it there. And Mr. McCombs, Jerry, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or am I completely off base?
Well, I wouldn't say that you're completely off base on that. I think that when we look at race, and I look at it from years ago when I was growing up, racism, we realize you're not born that way. You're taught, period. You're taught racism. Color makes a big difference in some people's lives. And some people think they have the upper hand when it comes to that. To give you another example, we still fighting racism as a day, and it's serious. There's still places right now in North Carolina that I cannot go. If I go to some counties in North Carolina, they will come and tell me, you don't belong in here, you need to leave. This is 2022. There's still places in North Carolina that we cannot go as an African American and be welcome, or to go by to visit. We will have to leave, and that's sad. So, to me, we have to be real careful to realize that God made us all. And I guess if people would really understand that no matter what color you are on the outside, that we should all treat each other right, and we should be equal, and we should be respected. And that's hard for some people to realize, because they was taught by their daddy, by their grandparents, by their great grandparents, on down generations. And some people will just not gonna let hatred go. Just not gonna let it go.
So help me understand, recognizing that there's a sleight of hand, people should be talking about class, they talk about race instead. And yet there's criticism of something that, at least on the surface, seems similar, which is a colorblind approach. Can you help us to understand what's the difference between what you're talking about and a colorblind approach in which we ignore race altogether?
Well, I will say up front, and I'll say I feel a little bit more at liberty to speak to these kinds of particular issues because I've got that distance now being at Bryant University. So, Mr. McCombs, I just wanted to echo what you shared as well. When I first moved to Hickory 10 years ago, I was told that there are specific places that I should not look for a house because it just would not be safe for me and my family. And I'm in an interracial marriage, and I now have biracial children. So I mean, this discrimination based on race is very much still alive and well in our country, and not just in North Carolina. It's here also in various parts of Rhode Island as well. But what I would say to folks who talk about colorblindness, I think it was Ibram Kendi and his work on how to be an anti-racist, but I've heard it sort of referenced so many times. When we talk about racism and race, it's like racism and race are the water and we're the fish swimming around in it. So as a fish swimming in the water, you don't necessarily know that it exists because that's your normalized environment, right? It's not until you're removed from that water that you recognize how much of a controlling factor and an influence it has had on the way that you've lived your life, right? So for folks to talk about colorblindness, and I've heard this said from a lot of people of color, is that if you say you don't see color, well, then you don't see me. Because people of color experience the world in the United States very differently in a variety of ways than folks who are not from various underrepresented and historically marginalized groups, be it in the form of microaggressions or overt systemic barriers that are put into place. It's just, to speak of colorblindness would be to not necessarily be part of resolving the issues of race racial inequalities that do exist. What I'm talking about is saying that you can't divorce class from talking about race, which means you also have to nuance the ways that we have created hierarchies based on class and added race as a qualifying layer to differentiate between peoples. As we were talking, I started to think to myself, sort of retract things. I'm like, maybe it's not race, maybe it's gender, because I go back to the ways in which women and women of color have been historically sort of oppressed and treated in certain ways. And we can get into that, whether it's Black women or Asian women, Indigenous women, what have you. And then yet that never seems to be, we're still in a state of gender inequality in the United States in a way that, when white women experience gender inequality, it's similar to Black women in some ways, but in other ways, very, very differently. So, what I'm saying is not necessarily to say, I don't see, if you say you're colorblind, you're saying you don't see a problem, which means you don't see the people who are suffering through some very real problems that exist in our country.
I would have to say along with that also is when, and I do, Dr. McComb, remember days where people say, I don't see color. And I think that's something that they really shouldn't say, because regardless of what you say or what you do, we know we have different races, different colors in the world. And we know that sometimes people don't respect that or look at the way it's posed, the way they should. And when they take it and say it like that, sometimes to me, I ask the question, so if you don't see color, then what do you see? Because it's obvious, of course, our blood is red, but my skin is a little darker than yours. So actually, if you don't see color, tell me, what do you see? What is the difference between me and you? It's color. So you have to see it. That's a scapegoat when they say that to me. And I'm like you, Dr. McComb, because you have to see the color. But in order to see it and accept it, then you have to deal with it.
I was just going to say, I know that, you know, in my field, in the field of education, when we are teaching future teachers, at least definitely when I'm teaching them, I teach them to be color conscious, and not just as it pertains to race, but really being able just to see difference in general, and just not seeing a mainstream kind of homogenous view of America and of their students. There's always pushback, and the pushback is, well, Dr. King said he wanted his kids not to be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And so there are, you know, many people who believe that perhaps we need to try to see beyond. As long as we continue to emphasize difference, will we continue to be divided by color? And I mean, this kind of gets what you're talking about, Dr. McComb, in your lecture, when you talk about unlearning what we have been taught about racism. And so I wonder, you know, there was a statement that connected, I think, to what you said in the history of race reading that you assigned for us all to read. And it really kind of struck a chord with me, and I'll quote it. It says, "Tragically, American culture from the very beginning developed around the ideas of race and racism," end quote. And so some would argue that our society is still sustained by this idea. I mean, we're talking about it right now. This is exactly what we're saying. While others would contend that such thinking is history. That was then, this is now. You know, we're post Dr. King, we're post Barack Obama. And I think ultimately these kind of divergent views seem to be at the heart of the whole critical race theory debate. Do we teach history as it was, or do we just not teach the history at all? And so I just wonder, as we try to unlearn past ways of thinking about race and current ways of thinking about race that are rooted in the past, what should we do with that statement just about the founding of America pretty much being centrally tied up with race and racism? How do we unlearn that?
That's a great question, Dr. Carroll. So I am on a board, a committee on teaching for the Organization of American Historians. And there I learned, we were working on a panel related to pedagogical responses to the resistance to integrating critical race theory into the classroom. Many of the folks on that committee also are either representatives from Florida, from Texas, or have colleagues, or Alabama, and have colleagues who work in those areas. And I was kind of, you know, I'm following these debates somewhat, and I was following when the sort of North Carolina Department of Education was also going through its revision of its essential learning outcomes, and that question came into the debate. And I remember holding my breath to see how North Carolina was going to respond, and to see that other places that are have outright banned any discussion of race. So not just critical race theory, any discussion of race, and that there's an actual gag order for their public school teachers, for K-12, for university teachers, that there's this real resistance to talking about the mistakes that are in the American past that have also had repercussions in the American present. This is a really complicated question because it assumes that, you know, past is past, and that somehow there are no echoes of those wrongs in our present day. If you do any work in sort of psychology, like Dr. Newton, and particularly social psychology, you talk about generational trauma, right? So that you have the sort of the ancestors, or the what's the word I'm looking for? The children and great-great-great-grandchildren, generations of folks whose, you know, great-great-great-grandparents were enslaved, or they were indigenous people who were all but annihilated in the United States, and then having to survive through decades and centuries of being told that you are not human, in some case, not enough, and that you need to be more like XYZ in order to be fully human. And I think that's the part of race that we lose, right? Is that since the founding of the United States, there have been very specific kind of parameters around what it meant to be American. A lot of that was tied up in race, and a lot of that is embedded in our Constitution at the time that the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the whole Constitution itself was written. It was very specific that these rights for wealthy, white, landowning men. And the reason why I like to talk about American history as the American experiment is because the grandiose ideas of the freedoms that are articulated in our founding documents, they get opened up to these different groups through our legal structures by saying, well, we say this in our founding documents, but we're not making good on this for these different groups of people, right? So then you see it opened up to African Americans after the Civil War. Then it takes a while for it to be opened up to women, and then opened up, and it's still a struggle with immigrants and immigrant status and things like that. It's essential to understand that the freedoms that we enjoy for today were never meant for a lot of us that are on this screen, and a lot of us that might be in this room who are not the majority white, right? And the fact that our systems, be it our economic systems, our education systems, were based on a very specific standard of white supremacy culture. Like, this is what it means to be educated, to have knowledge in this way, to value the written word above all else, to value literacy, to value being able to speak well, whatever that means, in terms of your tonal inflection and your accent. I used to have a very thick Boston accent, and for me to elevate my intelligence, I had to become very non-regionally associated. I've had students from North Carolina who've gone to other places in the country and be very self-conscious about their accents, and I'm afraid that people will think I'm less intelligent if I keep my accent. So these very both formal structures since the founding of the United States and informal social interactions that have reinforced these notions of white supremacy, these very specific versions of what success looks like. And I think in the United States, we're educated for two reasons, really, when it comes to social sciences and history specifically. We're educated to be good citizens. That means to be patriotic and to love one's country. And to love one's country as we have set it up, it means to question one's environments within limits, right? Within limits. We have the freedom of speech, but if you exercise that to critique the American education system, then suddenly, it's not such a positive response to the things that you might be saying, depending upon your audience, right? So there's a lot there to my answer, and I'm sorry if it's sort of all over the place in the response. But long story short, I 100% agree with that statement. Race is embedded in the structure that founded this country. And because we have not done the work to understand how much white supremacy culture, and I want to differentiate between white supremacy culture and white supremacy as this thing that folks might actively practice, right? Because I think that white supremacy, people will say, well, that's for people who are anti-Black, anti-anything, that I'm setting aside that. What I'm talking about is white supremacy culture, which is in the practices that we have, right? It's the beliefs that we have. It's the, how we define success fundamentally. As I said, that we value and elevate the written word, that we value and elevate sort of being able to read and write. When you had whole cultures, rich cultures that were completely oral traditions, right? They're less valuable in terms of what we consider as the pinnacle of culture than the written word. And that completely comes out of the white supremacy culture that we built. So I'll stop there.
I think that, I'm sorry. Okay, I think that we need to continue to mainly continue our history and let people know what things about and where we come from. let me go back to when I was in school. When I started school, remember my sister was the first African American that started the elementary school down here at Balls Creek Elementary School. Um, Second grade, I'll never forget, one of our Caucasian young ladies was passing out invitations. Her mother was having a Tupperware party, and she come to me and she said, "My mama don't want any colored people at the house," and went around me. Now, that wasn't as bad until when we got out of class, they went to recess. Everybody was showing their invitation. Everybody was showing their invitation. I had to tell them, mine is in my bag. That hurt. That hurt me as a young man. But I had to tell them that. I lied. I'll be honest with you, I lied. But I didn't know too much about the problems of the struggles that we was going through. As I went on, continue to go through at the elementary school, they would form clubs and they would form committees. No blacks allowed. I didn't say anything. Some of my teachers got the word. When they got the word, they automatically dismissed that. Oh no, we're not having it. And I'm saying that to say things like that I can't forget. I don't hold it against them because some of those same people have come to me and apologize. I said, no problem. I understand, because I know what was going back in the days. But I still think it's a part to where we need to continue to educate and let people know what happened. Not as much to pick or to fight. That's not the case. Just let them know what happened and where we're at now. And thank God, I'm glad things are now. They're not like they should be, but thank God not like they was years ago when I started school back in the late 60s.
I mean, obviously the past isn't just the past. Like there are echoes today. Otherwise you wouldn't have had the experiences that you had. And so right. I'm curious then, and there was a question that just came through the Q&A. So Rebecca W, she wanted us to talk a little bit about critical race theory and why is it so controversial? I'm curious, what do you think the very strong reactions to thinking about history in a way that's not the doctrinal, very linear way that we were taught American progress in the past? Why do you think there's such strong emotional reaction in the negative direction in many cases to doing that, to questioning the assumptions that you were talking about, Dr. McComb, to explaining the experiences that are very real for you in your past and your present, Mr. McCombs? Where does it come from?
I think people are just afraid that, I think I said earlier, if you continue to let them know what happened, they have a problem with that because to me, I think they're afraid to know that what they done was wrong. And I'm the first to tell you, I don't need nobody to come and tell me I'm sorry. I don't need that. I know what happened. I know what we experienced as an African American race. All I'm saying is I'm here now to try to make sure it doesn't happen again, and I'll do all I can to make sure it doesn't happen again. But I think when we come back and look at the history and how people are trying to back off and saying no, I really think they're afraid. That goes back to I was telling some people the other day, it's not as much as people nowadays are upset. It's some of the older ones, to me, because the reason why is because when you tell them they was wrong, then that goes back to grandfather being wrong, great-grandfather being wrong, great-grandfather being wrong. They don't want to hear that. They would really let that thing go and let things continue to stay like they are instead of really find out what truthfully happened and move forward. But I think until we do a lot of that and bring some of that out, just let people know what happened. It's not to cause a problem. Don't want to cause no war. Just let you know what happened and how far we've come. I think that education is more needed and more important, and we continue to use that than anything else.
Yeah. Jerry, I absolutely agree. And I would say that the fear comes from, once I know, I can't unknow.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
therefore
right.
I have some kind of obligation to do something or to change or to support change. And I don't know that I'm ready for that. So I will So give you a little bit of context to that. When I first started teaching in this field, it was in 2007. So this was before Barack Obama was elected the first Black president of the United States. And at that time, I was hard pressed to convince my students. I was teaching at BU and Boston University and Wheelock College at the time. I was hard pressed to convince my students that we still have a problem with race in the United States. They would often use the phrase of being in a post-racial era in US history. And then when Obama was elected, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to have such a hard time convincing folks that we have a problem with race now, because they'll say, how do we have a problem with race? We just elected the first Black president. I think we sort of solve things. If he could do it, any Black person could do it in the United States, right? Fast forward now to the pandemic and 2020 and the summer of 2020. I think it was the first time that millions of American people who couldn't go anywhere else because we were all in quarantine had access to the truths of what's happening in some places in the United States as a result of racism. And I'm talking about the murders of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, right? To say nothing of the murders that happened prior to that were captured on film, but not at a point where we all were just at home watching TV, streaming, looking at our news feeds, and it was just there, ever present, all the time. And I remember at that time feeling this real sense of fatigue, because many of my well-meaning white friends, they suddenly had this aha moment that race really was a problem in the United States, and began to use the language of, well, I never realized, I never knew, right? And to walk with my friends through that revelation was really painful for them. And they went through some really deep depression about, I don't know how to make sense of this in my head. This doesn't match with what I've been taught. I can't believe that I had not seen this before. I don't know what to do now. Can you help me understand what I should do now? And so when we try to implement something like critical race theory into the public school curriculum, what we're asking people to do is go through that very painful process, again, of unlearning and having these revelations of these key moments of triumph. Well, they came at a cost. They came at a cost of a lot of people. These real moments of progress, they were the result of efforts of a lot of people that were not acknowledged as a part of the narrative, right? Black and brown people, Asian people, indigenous people have been decentralized from the American narrative completely. And I'm not necessarily advocating for complete decentralization of whiteness. I'm talking about a completion of the American narrative, right? The completion of that story of the American experiment. And I think, to Jerry's point, people are really afraid of what they'll find if they go down that path. So in preparing the materials for the module, I was pulling up some things related to the 1619 project. I wanted to be able to give people access to what the project was actually about, because I had to sift through a lot of hate mail related to that project. And if you looked at the 1619 project, you know that it does this work of decentralizing that very Eurocentric narrative and looking at it from the perspective largely of Black peoples, but of people of color in general. And I'll tell you, I've done work for other community events related to looking at desegregation and integration. And the discourse in those documents about people being really resistant to integration smacks very uncomfortably of the same discourse around people being really resistant to critical race theory. Like, if I were to do a side-by-side comparison of the discourse and pull out any reference to the specifics of the 1619 project or integration, it'd be the same language.
As a historian, Are there criticisms that we can talk about the project? I know some prominent historians have engaged with it and have raised some questions about some of the conclusions. For example, that slavery was a central motivation for the Revolutionary War. There are some different kind of approaches to that particular assertion of the project. But so you're a historian. Is there a way to talk about the work divorced of this subtext, or is it all one and the same? Is history implicitly political now?
Yeah, I mean, history has always been implicitly political. So when we talk about training historians or training our future teachers who want to teach history, any text that you look at, any monograph is going to have obviously a particular set of viewpoints from the author, and the author, coming from all sorts of contexts, is going to have opinions influenced by that context because that's their lens, right? I think the challenge with the 1619 project is really that it was written by a journalist and not a historian, right? And we could talk about the differences in fields and things like that, but the point being is that the journalist is going to be very driven by story and by argument, and taking people through that to sort of convincing people of the argument through a very compelling story. A historian is very much going to focus on the documentation, the evidence, and build an argument and hopefully a story around it. Where a lot of historians fails is that they're terrible storytellers, sadly. There are some who strike that perfect balance of being great storytellers, also great sort of debaters in terms of historical argument, but they look at the evidence very, very carefully. So I would say the criticism that could lie with the 1619 project is that you have to look at it from the perspective of the training of the person who wrote it, which they're coming from the perspective of a journalist with a very clear agenda about sort of promoting a better understanding, a more nuanced understanding of the American past. Not to say that historians don't do the same thing in their work, but they're very much going to spend more time with context and documentation and building that richness of a body of evidence than a journalist would. And that's the same for like John Meacham has been touted as a historian, and he's a journalist. I'm forgetting his name, but he wrote the Devil in the White City, and he has been touted as a great historian, but he's a journalist, right? Fantastic narratives, fantastic storytelling, but it misses in some cases in terms of evidentiary support.
Thanks. Dr. McComb, there's very good questions coming in that we want to get to. But before we totally move off of just this topic of kind of critical race theory and even reaching back to the whole idea of colorblindness, I think that when you say completing the narrative, you're kind of moving from that melting pot metaphor of everyone blend in together and become Americanized into kind of this white American identity to the whole salad bowl metaphor, where we're all coming from different places, different backgrounds. And in a salad, you can all see our differences and it makes the salad rich. And so it's a more apt metaphor to really embrace diversity than the melting pot metaphor. Well, there's a question in the chat that says, would you say that instead of just saying I'm colorblind, to not say anything and let your actions with someone speak for itself? I'm wondering, how can we speak to that? I hear that a lot as well. I don't necessarily need to say that. And I tell my students, no, you don't need to go around saying, by the way, I'm conscious or I'm not colorblind. Your actions should speak for themselves, and because it is your mindset should be reflected in your actions. So I just wondered if you had anything more to say about that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think to not say anything and let your actions speak for themselves demonstrates a focus on you and not the deeper learning of what someone else might be experiencing. So I'm trying to think about how to sort of couch this in a way that might illustrate my point. So going back to the sort of the summer of 2020 and some conversations that I had with my white friends. There's one white friend in particular who just had a really hard time navigating her sort of new realization and understanding. And a lot of it came from, like, she and I have been friends for about 5 years. And there are things about my life that she never thought to ask about. She thought that simply by, loving me and we go to the same church, loving me as a sister in Christ would be sufficient by demonstrating that she herself did not judge me by the color of my skin. But she had no knowledge of the microaggressions that I experience every day, the obstacles that occurred, and the sort of underestimating that occurred in my upbringing because of the color of my skin, that folks like me who look like me, who come from a place where I came from, there were limitations placed on what I could do based on my identity, what people perceived about me, rather than me allowing me to live into my full potential. So the intent being that you want somebody to feel like you're not judging them, that's a good start. But there are things happening in the lives of people around you, and it doesn't necessarily have to be completely based on race. It could be based on a number of things. There are things happening in the lives of people around you that if seeking to learn more, you'd have a better understanding of not only what they're going through, but then also what might be happening in a larger context in terms of racial dynamics and systemic inequalities that exist in the United States. Do you think that answers the question?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. Thank you very much.
And I want to add to that also, if you don't mind. I will say, I agree with Dr. McComb. If you go and say that I'm not colorblind, eventually, to me, you pick it up, you'll notice it. Not saying I'm going around watching everybody do that, but it's just like as a Christian, you don't have to go around wearing a sign and say I'm a Christian. People see the way you act, the way you talk, and the way you do, and they can tell your life. Colorblind to me is the same way. You don't have to tell me that. There's something that you're going to do, say, present yourself in some kind of way to show me that you see one way or you see the other. To me, that's easy noticed.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. McCombs, I'm going to point out your voice is awesome, and we're so glad that we have it, especially because your video is frozen, unfortunately. So there are people in the chat.
I'm sorry.
We're so glad that you're here, and keep jumping in, please.
Okay.
Let's see. Well, let's keep this going. You can see, guys, I'm making it through with this voice here. Other questions in the chat. Here's someone that says, would you please respond to this statement? Quote, while white privilege may still exist in some society, it no longer reflects the progressive era we live in. And I can repeat that if you need me to. This is a statement. While white privilege may still exist in some margins of society, it no longer reflects the progressive era we live in. And when I read that, Dr. McComb, I thought about what you said about separating, this whole kind of belief of being, a white supremacist with white culture and just what the mainstream culture is. And so how can it not still be relevant in this era if it permeates, our society and being?
Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to see if I am interpreting the quotation correctly. So we're talking about white privilege. And I think that the quotation is somehow expressing that we've made significant progress when it comes to the pervasiveness of white privilege. Dr. Newton, you're nodding. You think that that's about in alignment? Okay. I am not going to deny progress that's been made. So I will say that outright. And I will say that, and I'll speak from the I and from sort of generational kinds of things that I've seen evolve in my own family history. So my mother, she's now 66 years old. And to this day, she can vividly recall when she was in the 2nd or 3rd grade, and she was dragged around the playground with a noose tied around her neck. She was one of, I think, only 3 children of color in the entire school at the time. And she was dragged around the playground with the noose tied around her neck and rocks thrown at her by her classmates while her teachers watched. And then when it was over and she went over crying to her teachers said, well, we saw you asking for it. So I could say in that regard, we've made significant progress, because I myself, I have not experienced anything like that, nor do I think anything like that would be tolerated in today's schools, at least broad scale. I'm sure that there are areas of the country in which this is still happening. But that's not to say that we don't have children still being bullied or teased or limitations placed on them because of the color of their skin. So that's to illustrate racism. To talk about white privilege, when we talk about progress, I think progress has been made in terms of access. When you talk about affirmative action, you talk about equal opportunity initiatives. When you talk about Roe v. Wade in terms of gender and reproductive rights. And this is all connected, I believe, to what we talk about, like the deeper sort of nuanced development of white privilege. We're talking about how, being male, white, heterosexual, Christian, and there's a few other categories are like the pinnacle of privilege. Meaning privilege essentially is that you do not have to be worried about or concerned that somehow limitations would be placed on you or doors would be closed to you because of who you are, right? I think we've made progress in terms of our legal system in order to create greater opportunity for people. But I think that we still have a very long way to go. So I will use, my current position within higher education as an example. So when I'm hiring for different positions, and we go through the regular process that we have, and then when we look at our pool of candidates and our finalists, or even just our semifinalists, our 10 group of our top candidates, they're all white and they're all predominantly male. And that would say, well, people say, well, we just chose the best candidate for the job, right? Not understanding that the systems that we put into place have inherent biases that have created the pool that we have. So that if we don't make the extra effort to deconstruct and dismantle that system, we're going to continue to see that same homogenous pool of folks when it comes to race, right? So to say that we've made progress, yes, but progress is insufficient, and progress is only sufficient if privilege is no longer an issue, and privilege is indeed still an issue.
And that questioning, the privilege of not having to question things, it's relevant to lots of conversations it seems like we're having about race right now, including the presence of Confederate monuments in locations. So if you might have a certain privileged position, that I don't have to necessarily question that this is anything more than just a moment in history that we're putting on a pedestal to remember history for the sake of history or something like that, without thinking about more than that. And Mr. McComb, I know you've been involved with some activism surrounding Confederate monuments here locally in our community of Catawba County, specifically a Confederate monument in front of the courthouse in Newton. I wondered, could you talk a little bit more about that?
The monument is white supremacists put up Jim Crow's days. and I don't have to say too much about Jim Crow. He just had no use for African Americans. And what we're trying to do is say, we understand it was put up. It's at the old courthouse. We would like to see it removed to another location. And I know a lot of people are saying, well, is that the museum? Well, really the property and the building still belongs to the county. So our taxpayers in Catawba County, we're paying to keep the grounds, the building, all that. We're paying all that. That's our money. We're paying it. We feel like that the monument should go at a more respected place, or where a lot of the soldiers are buried at. That's the way we feel. Not to tear it down, no, but because see, if you remember the days of the monument was put up because of the Civil War, and celebration, and y'all know, I don't have to tell you, how about the Civil War, that was mainly about slavery. Let's put it together. And we know that the South lost. We know that African Americans were not even allowed weapons in the South until about a month or so before the war ended. They was allowed weapons then because they knew that the South was losing, and they tried to make the South win. That history's up in the old courthouse also. So, I guess my main thing is we don't need to be reminded of that. We know what happened. We know what goes on. But to me, that's why I'm saying that's offensive to that be at a big old courthouse, which it's the museum is renting the property. It's at a place to where a prominent place in the town of Newton. That's one thing that they're fighting also in the courts. That if it's at the courthouse or if it's at a prominent place, it's a thing to be removed. So it's still in the courts. It's still several counties in North Carolina that still have a lawsuit out for that. And we really think that, not trying to make anyone mad, but we think a nice, better place for the monument to be is over where a lot of the Confederate soldiers are being buried at. We don't think it needs to be out in a prominent place of what it represents and what it symbolizes.
Thank you, Mr. McComb. And just in light of time, I'd like to end with a question back to your lecture, Dr. McComb. You ended your presentation with a call for us to be a part of the unmaking of the hierarchical categories. So do you have any thoughts on ways that, parents, families, and communities or others can actively and intentionally work at this kind of unmaking of race as we know it?
It seems small, but I can think of ways in which families can do this, especially at a very, very young age. So I regularly say that my 16-year-old self would be in shock and laugh at the fact that I became a history professor, because at 16 years old, I hated American history because it basically told me that everything about the people that I came from were substandard, and we just needed to work harder and we would be just as awesome as these wonderful historical figures who did so much for American progress. At the same time that I was reading those narratives in my US history classes, I grew up knowing very much that I came from indigenous heritage. So I read a lot of other narratives about African American history and Native American history, and then slowly became interested in the histories of peoples that were not like me. And it's like, well, if these parts of history are not in my history textbooks, then I can imagine, where's the history of my good friend who's Cambodian American, like or my friend who's Chinese American, whose family's been here for like 5 or 6 generations. Where are those histories? What I think has happened with children's literature these days, and just literature in general, my God, it's amazing. The expansion of perspectives of what it means to be a human in a different body, right? In an unapologetic way. And one of my favorite books I'm reading these days is by Sonia Renee Taylor, called The Body is Not an Apology. And it's all about understanding the power dynamics that exist that have created a sense of the default body. And in some ways, I prefer that to talking about white supremacy or white privilege, because it's less sort of button pushing. And it's thinking about, well, in our minds and historically, the default body is the white male, and any other body that comes into play is somehow othered, whether it's because of ability versus disability, whether it's based on gender, race, or ethnicity. And the literature that's out there for children these days is just absolutely phenomenal in terms of exploring different ways of being a human in this world. So I would start there. I would start with literature. I would start with music. Some of the work that I'm looking at right now is, and if you look at anything related to the history of African-American music, jazz, blues, spirituals, a lot of the pain, a lot of the narrative, if it wasn't written down, it was carried through song, right? So it's exposing yourself through these different cultural elements, poetry, short stories, novels, music, film, dance. I think that's food, food. I mean, these are ways to access different ways of being human that are sensory. They tap into emotions. They find common ground so that you can exercise what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls a muscular empathy, right? To tap in, if this is what sadness feels to me, and this song is very much about sadness, I could feel that sadness. I may not understand the context, but it gives me access to look for that context, right? So that's what I would say.
Dr. McComb, I could listen to you speak for hours, but unfortunately, we are here at the very end of our hour. So on behalf, Dr. Carroll and I think we both are in agreement for how fortunate we were to have both you and Mr. McCombs join us in conversation tonight. Recordings of tonight's discussion will be available on Canvas and on YouTube tomorrow. Next week, next Thursday at 6 o'clock, we will be joined by Dr. Scott Schaefer, an associate professor of biology here at LR, who's going to be talking about race and ancestry from a biological perspective that includes human origins as well as genetics. So thank you for joining us here today, and thank you to everyone who chipped in with questions. We didn't get to them all. They were excellent questions. Keep it up. This is going to make our class awesome, your participation. Y'all have a good evening.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for having me. And this has been great. And thank you everyone for your great questions.
Thank you both.